Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Anthony Trollope's novel, Barchester Towers, and we are up to Chapter 2, which is titled Hiram's Hospital According to Act of Parliament. It is hardly necessary that I should here give to the public any lengthened biography of Mr. Harding up to the period of the commencement of this tale. And yet, that's exactly what you're about to do. The public cannot have forgotten how ill that sensitive gentleman bore the attack that was made on him in the columns of the Jupiter with reference to the income which he received as warden of Hiram Hospital in the city of Barchester. Nor can it yet be forgotten that a lawsuit was instituted against him on the matter of that charity by Mr. John Bold, who afterwards married his daughter, Mr. Harding's younger and only unmarried daughter. Under pressure of these attacks, Mr. Harding had resigned his wardenship, though strongly recommended to abstain from doing so, both by his friends and by his lawyers. He did, however, resign it, and betook himself manfully to the duties of the small parish of St. Cuthbert's in the city, of which he was vicar, continuing also to perform those of precentor of the cathedral, handling the music of the cathedral. A situation of small emolument which had hitherto been supposed to be joined, as a matter of course, to the wardenship of the hospital above spoken of. When he left the hospital from which he had been so ruthlessly driven, and settled himself down in his own modest manner in the High Street of Barchester, he had not expected that others would make more of fuss about it than he was inclined to do so himself, and the extent of his hope was that the movement might have been made in time to prevent any further paragraphs in the Jupiter. His affairs, however, were not allowed to subside thus quietly, and people were quite as much inclined to talk about the disinterested sacrifice he had made as they had before been to upbraid him for his cupidity. The most remarkable thing that occurred was the receipt of an autograph letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury, in which the primate very warmly praised his conduct and begged to know what his intentions were for the future. Mr. Harding replied that he intended to be rector of St. Cuthbert's in Barchester, and so the matter dropped. Then the newspaper took up his case, the Jupiter among the rest, and wafted his name in eulogistic strains through every reading room in the nation. It was discovered also that he was the author of that great musical work, Harding's Church Music, and a new edition was spoken of, though, I believe, never printed. It is, however, certain that the work was introduced into the Royal Chapel at St. James, and that a long criticism appeared in the Musical Scrutator, declaring that in no previous work of the kind had so much research been joined with such exalted musical ability, and asserting that the name of Harding would be henceforth known wherever the arts were cultivated or religion valued. This was high praise, and I will not deny that Mr. Harding was gratified by such flattery, for if Mr. Harding was vain on any subject, it was that of music. But here the matter rested. The second edition, if printed, was never purchased. The copies which had been introduced into the Royal Chapel disappeared again, or were laid by in peace with a load of similar literature. Mr. Towers of the Jupiter and his brethren occupied themselves with other names, and the undying fame promised to our friend was clearly intended to be posthumous. Mr. Harding had spent much of his time with his friend the bishop, much with his daughter, Mrs. Bold, now, alas, a widow, and had almost daily visited the wretched remnant of his former subjects, the few surviving bedesmen now left at Hiram's Hospital. 6 of them were still living. The number, according to old Hiram's will, should always have been 12, but after the abdication of their warden, the bishop had appointed no successor to him. No new occupants of the charity had been nominated, and it appeared as though the hospital at Barchester would fall into abeyance, unless the powers that be should take some steps toward putting it once more into working order. During the past 5 years, the powers that be had not overlooked Barchester Hospital, and sundry political doctors had taken the matter in hand. Shortly after Mr. Harding's resignation, the Jupiter had very clearly shown what ought to be done. In about half a column, it distributed the income, rebuilt the building, put an end to all bickerings, regenerated kindly feeling, provided Mr. Harding, and placed the whole thing on the footing which could not but be satisfactory to the city and the Bishop of Barchester and to the nation at large. Note the cutting edge there. Trollope does not like the Jupiter, which is his stand-in for the Times. I just like how all-knowing they pretend to be. The wisdom of this scheme was testified to by numbers of letters which Common Sense or Veritas or One Who Loves Fair Play sent to the Jupiter, all expressing admiration and amplifying on the details given. In other words, they're written under those names. The people didn't want to give their real names. Much different from today, when people who write crackpot letters to the editor of the Times very happily give their names. It is singular enough that no adverse letter appeared at all, and therefore none, of course, was written. Again, another dig at the Times. They're only printing letters that second their own proposals, so of course they must not have got any that didn't. Trollope, when he's irritated, lets you know. But Cassandra was not believed, and that is a classical reference to Princess of Troy, who was given the gift of infallible prophecy, but also cursed that no one would ever believe her prophecies. But Cassandra was not believed, and even the wisdom of the Jupiter sometimes falls on deaf ears. Though other plans did put themselves forward in the columns of the Jupiter, reformers of church charities were not slack to make known in various places their different nostrums for setting Hiram's Hospital on its feet again. A learned bishop took occasion in the upper house to allude to the matter, intimating that he had communicated on the subject with his right reverend brother of Barchester. The radical member for Stalybridge had suggested that the fund should be alienated for the education of the agricultural poor of the country, and he amused the House by some anecdotes touching on the superstition and habits of the agriculturalists in question. Mocking poor people, in other words. A political pamphleteer had produced a few dozen pages, which he called, quote, "Who are John Hiram's heirs?" intending to give an infallible rule for the governance of all such establishments, and at last, a member of the government promised that in the next session a short bill should be introduced for regulating the affairs of Barchester and other kindred concerns. The next session came, and contrary to custom, the bill came also. Men's minds were then intent on other things. The first threatenings of a huge war hung heavily over the nation, and the question as to Hiram's heirs did not appear of interest to many people, either in or out of the House. The bill, however, was read and reread, and in some undistinguished manner passed through its 11 stages without appeal or dissent. What would John Hiram have said in the matter, could he have predicted that some 45 gentlemen would take on themselves to make a law altering the whole purport of his will, without in the least knowing at the moment of their making it what it was that they were doing? It is, however, to be hoped that the Undersecretary for the Home Office knew, for to him the matter had been confided. The bill, however, did pass, and at the time at which this history is supposed to commence, it had been ordained that there should be, as heretofore, 12 old men in Barchester Hospital, each with 1 shilling a day, and that there should also be 12 old women to be located in a house to be built, each with 1 shilling a day, that there should be a matron with a house and £70 a year, and a steward with 150 a year, and latterly a warden with 450 a year, who should have the spiritual guidance of both establishments, and the temporal guidance of that appertaining to the male sex. The bishop, dean, and warden were, as formerly, to appoint in turn the recipients of the charity, and the bishop was to appoint the officers. There was nothing said as to the wardenship being held by the precentor of the cathedral, nor a word to Mr. Harding's right to the situation. All that fuss. We go back to having the exact same setup, only more expensive. More money to be paid. There's a new building to be made for female beads women, and they're to have a caretaker with an annual salary. But after all that fuss, when all this is made by a bill of Parliament, no one thinks to give it back to Mr. Harding. I'm not sure that he would take it. He probably wouldn't. But it was not, however, till some months after the death of the old bishop, and almost immediately consequent on the installation of his successor, that notice was given that the reform was about to be carried out. The new law and the new bishop were among the earliest works of a new ministry, or rather of a ministry who, having for a while given place to their opponents, had then returned to power. And the death of Dr. Grantley occurred, as we have seen, exactly at the period of the change. Poor Eleanor Bold. How well does that widow's cap become her, and the solemn gravity with which she devotes herself to her new duties. Poor Eleanor. Poor Eleanor. She said 3 times. I cannot say that with me John Bold was ever a favorite. I never thought him worthy of the wife he had won. But in her estimation he was most worthy. Hers was one of those feminine hearts which cling to a husband, not with idolatry, for worship can admit of no defect in its idol, but with the perfect tenacity of ivy. As the parasite plant will follow even the defects of the trunk which it embraces, so did Eleanor cling to and love the very faults of her husband. She had once declared that whatever her father did should be right in her eyes. She then transferred her allegiance and became ever ready to defend the worst failings of her lord and master. And John Bold was a man to be loved by a woman. He was himself affectionate. He was confiding and manly. And that arrogance of thought, unsustained by first-rate abilities, that attempt at being better than his neighbors, which jarred so painfully on the feelings of his acquaintance, did not injure him in the estimation of his wife. Could she even have admitted that he had a fault, his early death would have blotted out the memory of it. She wept as for the loss of the most perfect treasure which mortal women had ever been endowed. For weeks after he was gone, the idea of future happiness in this world was hateful to her. Consolation, as it is called, was insupportable, and tears and sleep were her only relief. But God tempers the wind to the shorn lamb. She knew that she had within her the living sources of other cares. Kind of a weird way to say that she's pregnant, but she knew that there was to be created for her another subject of weal or woe, of unutterable joy or despairing sorrow, as God in his mercy might vouchsafe to her. At first this did but augment her grief. To be the mother of a poor infant, orphaned before it was born, brought forth to the sorrows of an ever desolate hearth, nurtured amidst tears and wailing, and then turned adrift into the world without the aid of a father's care. There was at first no joy in this. Well, not when you put it that way, you Debbie Downer. By degrees, however, her heart became anxious for another object, and, before its birth, the stranger was expected with all the eagerness of a longing mother. A recurring thing in Victorian fiction, how often a baby in the womb is referred to as the stranger. Just 8 months after the father's death, a second John Bold was born, and if the worship of one creature can be innocent in another, let us hope that the adoration offered over the cradle of the fatherless infant may not be imputed as a sin. And at this point, you are saying to yourself, okay, got the point. Eleanor Bold was pregnant when John Bold died. She's given birth to a baby and named it John Bold. And at this point in the reading of chapter 2, you are saying, please God, Trollope, do not write about the baby. We get the point. Unfortunately, God might temper the wind to the shorn lamb, but he is turning a deaf ear on you, please. It will not be worth our while to define the character of the child. Yes, that's exactly what you're going to do. Or to point out how far the faults of the father were redeemed within the little breast by the virtues of the mother. The baby, as a baby, was all that was delightful, and I cannot foresee that it will be necessary for us to inquire into the facts of his afterlife. Our present business at Barchester will not occupy us above a year or two at the furthest. The novelist saying the time frame of his book. And I will leave it to some other pen to produce, if necessary, the biography of John Bold the younger. But as a baby, this baby was all that could be desired. This fact no one attempted to deny. No one thought they would. No one's bringing it up but you insufferable windbag. Is he not delightful? She would say to her father, looking up into his face from her knees, her lustrous eyes overflowing with soft tears, her young face encircled by her close widow's cap, and her hands on each side of the cradle in which her treasure was sleeping. The grandfather would gladly admit that the treasure was delightful, and the uncle archdeacon himself would agree, and Mrs. Grantley, Eleanor's sister, would re-echo the word with true sisterly energy. And Mary Bold was a second worshipper at the same shrine. The baby was really delightful. Oh. Okay, all right, let's just push on. The baby was really delightful. He took his food with a will, struck out his toes merrily whenever his legs were uncovered, and did not have fits. These are supposed to be the strongest points of baby perfection, and in all of these, our baby excelled. Great, thanks. Can we move on? And thus the widow's deep grief was softened, and a sweet balm was poured into the wounds with which she had thought nothing but death could heal. A balm? Bring a balm around a baby? Sorry, couldn't help myself. How much kinder is God to us than we are willing to be to ourselves? At the loss of every dear face, at the last going of every well-beloved one, we all doom ourselves to an eternity of sorrow, and look to waste ourselves away in an ever-running fountain of tears. How seldom does such grief endure? How blessed is the goodness which forbids it to do so! Let me ever remember my living friends, but forget them as soon as they may be when they are dead, was the prayer of a wise man who understood the mercy of God. Few, perhaps, would have the courage to express such a wish, and yet to do so would only be to ask for that release from sorrow which a kind Creator almost always extends to us. Bullcrap. No one asks to forget the dead. They just ask to stop grieving. That's all. And it's natural, as this passage is pointing out, that the most severe grief in the world, if it's natural, if it runs its course, will eventually subside. You will remember them. You will be sorry they were gone. You will wish they were back. But you won't be actively... Grief is a particular state of mind. It's an agony. And it goes away. But anyway, I would not, however, have it imagined that Mrs. Bold forgot her husband. Good, although you just said that. She daily thought of him with all conjugal love, and enshrined his memory in the innermost center of her heart. But yet she was happy in her baby. It was so sweet to press the living toy to her breast, and feel that a human being existed who did owe and was to owe everything to her, whose daily food was drawn from herself, whose little wants could all be satisfied by her, whose little heart would first love her and her only, whose infant tongue would make it first offer in calling her by the sweetest name a woman can bear. OMG. And so Eleanor's bosom became tranquil, and she set about her new duties eagerly and gratefully. As regards the concern of the world, John Bold had left his widow in prosperous circumstances. He had bequeathed to her all that he possessed, and that comprised an income much exceeding what she or her friends thought was necessary for her. It amounted to nearly 1,000 a year, and when she reflected on its extent, her dearest hope was to hand it over, not only unimpaired, but increased, to her husband's son, to her own little darling, to the little man who now lay sleeping on her knee, happily ignorant of the cares which were to be accumulated on his behalf. When John Bold died, she earnestly implored her father to come and live with her, but this Mr. Harding declined, for for some weeks he remained with her as a visitor. He could not be prevailed upon to forego the possession of a small home of his own, and so remained in the lodgings he had first selected over a chemist's shop in the High Street of Barchester. And as she's forever waffling on about how adorable her baby is, we can probably understand why he wanted to have a room of his own. Anyway, that is chapter 2 of Barchester Towers. And from this, we can glean a few things. We can glean a few things from this chapter. The first one is a minor one. Trollope brings it up, hashes it out for half of a chapter, and drops it, is never going to raise it again, which is that briefly, after the events in the Warden, Mr. Harding was famous. He was a star for having selflessly walked away from a government emolument that he could easily have kept. All he had to do was stay the course. His friends and lawyers were telling him, just stay the course. This will blow over. But he couldn't stand reading those wounding paragraphs in the Jupiter, so he walked away from it. And we learn that in the aftermath of that, he was briefly famous. His insufferable book was lodged in the chapel at St. James, for a while anyway, until it was put in some back room and forgotten about. We learned that. We also learned that John Bold, the troublemaker in the Warden, the guy who started all of this, was as sweet and unoffending a soul as Dr. Grantley, as Mr. Harding. We learned that he's the one who started all the trouble, and we learn that he's dead, and that he has a little baby boy. And we learn that, as an offhand reference, we learn that Hiram's Hospital is going to be put back on a paying basis and have a warden again. We're never going to have a book about that warden, not at all. In other words, it's easy to interpret from the statements in this chapter that the whole of the events in the Warden were a tempest in a teapot. They happened, they were the talk of a season, then they were over, and things were right back to normal. And we also learned at insufferable length that Eleanor Bold had a baby. She had a baby boy. She thinks he's adorable. I want to point out two things here, and they might seem to contradict each other, but they don't really. One is that the person who is telling you the story in Trollope, there is always a person, there is always a narrator who's telling you, almost always, there is a narrator who's telling you the story in Trollope. Certainly in the best Trollope there is. There's a narrator who's definitely present in the story. The narrator's not Trollope. At least it would be a little bit childish to make it that way, and literary criticism today would say no. Obviously, the narrator can't be Trollope, because the narrator knows fictional characters, and Trollope doesn't. But however you want to think of it, whether you think of it as Trollope, the storyteller, or whether you think of it as someone in the story, I think it's someone in the story. We have seen before, we saw in The Warden, that the narrator mentions growing up with some of the characters. I think the narrator is supposed to be just a person telling us the story. And one of the two things we can glean from this chapter is that Trollope's narrator is wonderful. His ability to make you feel as if someone is just telling you the most comfortable, interesting story in the world is incredible. It is absolutely incredible. It's a facet of Trollope's writing that I have to remember every time I pick up a book of his. For some reason, it's such a spell. Instead of a function, it really is a kind of an intangible thing. That it's only when I pick up a Trollope book and start reading again that I remember, oh, right, this is wonderful to read. And it's in large part because of that narrator. It's the narrator who tells us, I never thought that much of John Bold. I never liked him all that much. I never thought that he was worthy of the wife that he won. That's not any character in the story telling us that. That's a narrator telling us that. And it feels wonderful. It feels like a confidence over a fire at night. That's one thing that we should glean from this. The other thing we should glean from this is that this was serialized. Like most of Trollope, this was serialized before it was published as a book. And if you're serializing something, you are working by the page, by the word count. You need to fill out the next issue. And that can often lead even a skilled storyteller to pad. And I think it's safe to call Chapter 2 mostly padding. It's safe to say that. I mean, who ultimately, in the view of the larger plot of Barchester Towers, who is going to care that Hiram's Hospital is refinanced and is going to be refilled with old beadsmen? In the larger story, who is going to care or that Eleanor Bold loves her baby? Who's going to assume that she doesn't? For it to go on and on and on like that. Oh, he sticks out his toes. Oh, he eats his food. Oh, he's a delightful baby in every way. Let me tell you about him for 6 paragraphs. In this chapter, the point I want to make is that the point of that was the 6 chapters, or 6 paragraphs, not that it's important to the story. You just have to keep that in mind when you're reading a work that was initially serialized. You have to keep in mind sometimes the author is going to go on just to fill the space allotted, just because I've got so much that my editor wants by Friday. Unfortunately, this applies even to Trollope. There's hardly an author who serialized work that doesn't fall prey to this at some point or other. I would argue that the two balance each other. That narrative presence of Trollope is so wonderful that even his padding is fun to read. So, well, that is Chapter 2. We will move on to Chapter 3 next time. I'm not even going to promise that it will be read without commentary. So I'm assuming that you are signed up for that with this. So I'll wrap this chapter up for now. We'll move on to Chapter 3 next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.